Blood streaked across the evening sky as Delilah Wright watched her last chance at salvation ride away from the Crossroads Ranch. The riders carried news of her shame, spreading it like wildfire through the New Mexico Territory of 1879. Her reputation in tatters, she stood at the edge of the property her father had left her, wondering how long before they came to drive her out. The whispers had started 3 months ago when she refused Reverend Michael's persistent courtship, his wounded pride twisting into accusations that shocked the God-fearing folk of Redemption Springs. The town that once welcomed the schoolteacher now crossed the street to avoid her shadow. Children were kept from her classroom and mothers clutched their sons closer when she passed. Witch, they'd whispered first, then harlot followed, now they didn't whisper at all. Delilah wiped dirt-stained hands on her apron, surveying the small homestead she'd fought to maintain since her father's passing last winter. The modest 2-room cabin, the struggling vegetable garden, and the empty corral where her father's horses once stood before debts forced their sale, all of it seemed as fragile as her standing in the community. The setting sun painted long shadows across the yard as she retreated inside, bolting the door against the growing darkness. The letter from the church elders lay open on the rough-hewn table, the formal language cutting deeper than any knife. Your continued presence brings moral corruption to our community. We recommend you make arrangements to depart Redemption Springs with haste. Delilah sank into her father's chair, fingers tracing the worn wood where he'd sat every evening, Bible in hand. What would he say now, seeing his daughter branded unholy by the very community he'd helped build? A tear slipped down her cheek as she stared at the last ember in the fireplace, wondering if there was any path forward that didn't lead to ruin. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her cabin. Fear clutched at her throat had the townspeople decided talking wasn't enough. Rising quickly, she reached for her father's old shotgun hanging above the mantel. Her hands trembled as she loaded it, praying she wouldn't need to use it. A single knock rattled the door. "Miss, anyone home?" The voice was deep, unfamiliar, with a slight drawl that marked him as not from these parts. Delilah approached cautiously. "State your business or move along." "Name's Isaac Blackburn, madam. Just passing through and saw your chimney smoke. Been riding 2 days straight and looking for a place to water my horse." She hesitated, shotgun still in hand. Strangers were rare this far from the main trail, and strangers could be dangerous, but they also didn't know her story. "There's a creek 50 yards east," she called through the door. "Help yourself and be on your way." Silence followed, then a soft chuckle. "Much obliged, though I'd pay fair for a meal if you've got one to spare. Been living on jerky and hardtack since Santa Fe." Something in his voice, a weariness that matched her own, made Delilah lower the gun. Curiosity, or perhaps the simple human need for conversation with someone who didn't look at her with disgust, moved her to unlock the door. The man standing on her porch was tall and lean, trail dust covering every inch of him. His dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep blue and clear, watching her with neither judgment nor desire, just simple human acknowledgement. He tipped his hat, revealing a thin scar that ran along his hairline. "Evening, madam. The creek's that way," she repeated, gesturing with the shotgun. "I see you're cautious. Smart for a woman alone." His gaze drifted to the gun, then back to her face. "I'll water my horse and be on my way if that's what you prefer." Against her better judgment, Delilah found herself saying, "I've stew on the fire. Nothing fancy, but it's hot." Surprise flickered across his weathered face, followed by a smile that softened his features considerably. "That's mighty kind. I can pay. I don't need your money," she interrupted, stepping back to allow him entry. "But I wouldn't mind news from beyond these hills." Isaac nodded, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "Fair trade, then." As he settled his horse in the empty corral, Delilah stirred the rabbit stew, adding water to stretch it for two. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a visitor who wasn't delivering bad news or judgment. It felt strange, almost forbidden, to prepare a meal for a man, especially with the town already convinced of her moral failing. When he returned, he'd removed his duster, revealing a simple cotton shirt and worn leather vest. A holstered revolver hung at his hip, but he unbuckled the gun belt and respectfully placed it near the door before sitting at her table. "Smells like heaven," he commented as she ladled stew into a chipped bowl. "It's just rabbit and whatever the garden's giving," Delilah replied, placing the bowl before him along with a chunk of cornbread. "After trail rations, this is a feast." He waited until she'd served herself before picking up his spoon, manners that surprised her. They ate in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "You've got a nice place here. Seems like hard work keeping it up alone." "It was my father's," she explained, finding herself unusually willing to talk. "He passed last winter. Pneumonia took him. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." The simple words of sympathy, offered without the town's usual follow-up whispers about God's judgment, felt genuine. "You mentioned news," Isaac said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "What would you like to know? I've come up from Texas through most of the territory." "Anything," she replied honestly. "It's been quiet here lately." He studied her face for a moment, seeming to read something in her expression. "Well, the railroad's pushing west faster than ever. They're saying in 5 years, you'll be able to ride from Atlantic to Pacific without changing trains." For the next hour, Isaac filled her small cabin with tales from his travels, cattle drives in the Texas Panhandle, mining towns springing up like weeds in Colorado, the growing settlements along the Rio Grande. He spoke of a changing world, of civilization encroaching on the wild lands, of opportunities and dangers in equal measure. Delilah found herself captivated, not just by the stories but by the man himself. He spoke with neither boasting nor false modesty, simply relating what he'd seen with his own eyes. It had been so long since she'd had a conversation that wasn't laden with judgment or pity. "And what brings you through Redemption Springs?" she finally asked as she gathered their empty bowls. "We're hardly on the way to anywhere." A shadow crossed his face. "I'm tracking someone, a man who needs answering to." "You're a lawman then?" Isaac shook his head. "No, madam, just a man with unfinished business." The way his hand unconsciously moved toward where his gun belt would have been told her enough. Vengeance, then. She'd seen enough of that in these parts to recognize its shape. "And after this, business is concluded?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. He met her eyes, something unreadable in his gaze. "Haven't thought that far ahead, been chasing 3 years now." The conversation shifted to safer topics as night fully descended. When Isaac finally rose to leave, Delilah found herself reluctant to see him go. "The barn has a decent hayloft," she offered. "Better than sleeping rough, at least." He studied her for a long moment. "People might talk, seeing a stranger's horse here come morning." Delilah's laugh held no humor. "Mr. Blackburn, believe me when I say they're already talking." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Then I accept your hospitality, Miss Wright, Delilah Wright, Miss Wright." He collected his gun belt. "I'll be gone at first light, don't want to bring you any trouble." "Trouble's already found me," she replied softly as she watched him walk toward the barn, wondering what kind of man inspired 3 years of pursuit. And what kind of man would give 3 years of his life to such a chase? Delilah woke before dawn, the habit of a schoolteacher never quite leaving her despite the empty classroom that awaited no longer. She lit the kitchen stove and began preparing a simple breakfast, telling herself it was only good manners to feed a guest before sending him on his way. The sound of the pump outside told her Isaac was already awake. Minutes later, he appeared at the door, face freshly washed, hair still damp. "Morning," he said, hat in hand. "Wasn't expecting breakfast." "It's nothing special," she replied, gesturing to the table where cornmeal mush bubbled in a pot beside a small jar of precious honey. "But it'll keep you until midday." They ate mostly in silence, the intimacy of early morning making conversation seem unnecessary. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, Isaac finally spoke. "I want to thank you for your kindness, Miss Wright. It's rare to find these days." "You're welcome, Mr. Blackburn." "Isaac, please," she nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Isaac, then." He studied her for a moment, seeming to wrestle with something. "If you don't mind my asking, what did you mean last night, about trouble already finding you?" Delilah stiffened, the smile vanishing. She busied herself with clearing the bowls. "It's nothing of consequence." "Forgive me," he said quickly. "Not my place to pry. No, it's—" She sighed, setting the bowls down harder than intended. "This town has decided I'm not fit for decent company, that's all." Isaac's expression darkened. What could a schoolteacher possibly have done to earn that? The fact that he'd noticed the books lining her shelves and correctly guessed her profession touched her. "I refused the advances of a man of influence. He didn't take kindly to rejection. And that's enough to turn a town against you. It is when the man is Reverend Michaels, and when he spreads rumors that I practice ungodly arts." The bitterness she'd tried so hard to contain seeped into her voice. "They told me I'm unholy, that my presence corrupts their children." Isaac's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the surface. "I've seen this before, men using faith as a weapon when they can't get what they want." "Well, they're winning," she admitted, gesturing to the letter still on the table. "The church council has asked me to leave Redemption Springs." He picked up the letter, scanning its contents with growing anger visible in his eyes. "This is what passes for Christian charity these days. It's the way of things," Delilah replied, taking the letter back. "I have an aunt in Denver who might take me in, though we haven't spoken in years." Isaac stood abruptly, reaching for his hat. "I should go." "Of course," she said, startled by his sudden shift. "I didn't mean to burden you with my troubles." He paused at the door, turning back with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You didn't burden me, Miss Wright." But a man shouldn't stay where he might make things worse. Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Through the window, she watched him saddle his horse with efficient movements. Part of her wanted to call him back, to ask him to stay just a little longer, but what purpose would that serve? He had his path to follow, and she had hers, both leading away from this moment, this cabin, this brief connection. As he mounted his horse, he looked back toward the house. Their eyes met through the window, and he tipped his hat in a final farewell before turning the animal toward town and riding away. Delilah stood watching until horse and rider disappeared beyond the hill, feeling somehow more alone than she had before he'd arrived. The town of Redemption Springs prided itself on its orderliness. A single main street lined with whitewashed buildings, a church with a steeple that reached toward heaven, and citizens who knew their place in God's plan, or so Reverend Michaels reminded them every Sunday. Isaac rode slowly down that main street, taking the measure of the place as he always did when entering a new town. The general store, the blacksmith shop, a small hotel with vacancy painted in the window, and at the far end, a saloon that tried to look respectable with fresh paint but couldn't quite hide its true nature. He dismounted outside the hotel, securing his horse to the hitching post. His business in town was twofold: now gather information about the man he hunted, and perhaps learn a bit more about the situation facing Delilah Wright. "Morning," the hotel clerk greeted him, a thin man with spectacles perched on a narrow nose. "Looking for a room." "Just information for now," Isaac replied, placing a coin on the counter. "Been tracking a man named Silas Vaughn. Heard he might have passed through these parts." The clerk's expression didn't change, but his eyes darted briefly toward the saloon. "Can't say I recall anyone by that name registering here." "Tall fellow, scar across his right cheek, usually travels with two others." The clerk shook his head. "Sorry, mister, we don't get many strangers here in Redemption Springs." Isaac nodded, sliding another coin across the counter. "How about a woman named Delilah Wright, schoolteacher, I believe?" At this, the clerk's demeanor changed entirely, his posture stiffening. "Miss Wright, what's your business with her?" just curious. Met her on the trail, offered me water when my canteen was dry, seemed like a kindly sort. The clerk glanced around nervously before leaning forward. You do well to keep your distance from that one stranger. She's not what she seems. How's that? Reverend says she's been consorting with dark powers. Folk have seen lights in her cabin at all hours, heard strange chanting. Children who went to her school started having nightmares. The clerk crossed himself. She bewitched the reverend himself when he tried to save her soul. Isaac kept his face neutral despite the anger building inside him. Is that so? God's truth. Towns finally decided she needs to go before she brings misfortune on us all. The clerk straightened, seemingly pleased to have shared this information. If you met her on the trail, you're lucky to have escaped her influence. I'll keep that in mind, Isaac replied evenly. Any other accommodations in town? The clerk pointed him toward the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Perkins, and Isaac took his leave, mind churning with what he'd learned. The accusations against Delilah were even more ridiculous than she'd let on and more dangerous. People afraid of witchcraft didn't stop at running someone out of town. History had taught that lesson too many times. The saloon was his next stop, the likeliest place to hear about Silas Vaughn without arousing suspicion. Inside, the place was nearly empty, with only the bartender and two men playing cards at a corner table. Isaac ordered whiskey, using the mirror behind the bar to study the card players. One was clearly a local well-dressed, soft-handed, likely a merchant or banker. The other had the hard look of a man who lived by his gun, though he wore no obvious weapon in town. After a suitable interval of nursing his drink, Isaac approached their table. Room for another player, the well-dressed man looked up with a frown. Private game, friend. Jake, the other man chided, where's your hospitality? He gestured to the empty chair. Pull up a seat, stranger. I'm Doyle and this here's Jake Simmons, owner of our general store. Isaac Blackburn, he introduced himself, settling into the chair, just passing through. Most folks are, Doyle commented, dealing him into the next hand. What brings you to our little piece of nowhere? Looking for work, maybe, Isaac replied, arranging his cards. Heard the railroad might be hiring. Simmons snorted. Railroad's 50 miles south and likely to stay that way. The conversation flowed easily as they played, Isaac losing just enough to keep them interested but not enough to empty his pockets. After an hour and several drinks, Doyle had warmed considerably. You got the look of a man who's done some rangering, the gunman observed. Am I right? Isaac shrugged. Did my time along the border wasn't for me in the end. Thought so, Doyle nodded approvingly. Takes one to know one. I rode with the Arizona Volunteers myself before settling into more private work. Hired gun then. Isaac's instincts had been correct. Any good opportunities around here? He asked casually. Might be, Doyle replied, glancing at Simmons. Town's looking to resolve a problem, could use another reliable man. What kind of problem? Simmons leaned forward. We've got a woman out on the old Wright place. Dabbles in the dark arts, turning folks against each other. Reverend's tried reasoning with her, but she's stubborn. And now she's refusing to leave town despite the council's decision, Doyle added. Some of us are thinking a more direct approach might be necessary. Isaac fought to keep his expression neutral. Sounds serious. It is, Simmons insisted, his face flushing with either drink or fervor. My own boy was in her school, started talking crazy, saying maybe the Indians have souls just like white folk. Said she taught them that God loves all his children the same. Dangerous ideas, Isaac said, tone carefully balanced between agreement and neutrality. Damn right they are, Simmons slapped the table. Next thing you know, she'll be saying women should vote or some such nonsense. So what's this? Direct approach you're considering? Doyle and Simmons exchanged glances. Nothing too harsh, Doyle said smoothly. Just a nighttime visit, some persuasion to make her understand it's time to move on, no real harm done. When? Isaac asked, heart pounding despite his outward calm. Tonight, Simmons answered. After services. Reverend Michaels himself gave his blessing, though unofficial-like, said sometimes the Lord's work requires firm hands. I might be interested, Isaac said carefully. Always good to get in the town's good graces when you're new. Doyle studied him for a long moment before nodding. Meet behind the church at 9. Bring a mask if you've got one. No need to advertise our business. Isaac agreed, finished his drink, and excused himself from the game. As soon as he was out of sight of the saloon, he mounted his horse and rode hard out of town, back toward Delilah's cabin. He had hours before the mob would form, but not enough time for the warning he needed to deliver and the preparations they'd need to make. Delilah was hanging laundry when she heard the approaching rider. Her heart leapt foolishly at the thought it might be Isaac returning, though she told herself it was more likely townspeople coming to harass her further. When she recognized the rider, confusion warred with a relief she didn't want to examine too closely. Isaac dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face grim. "Pack whatever you can't bear to lose," he said without preamble. "We need to leave before nightfall." "What?" "Why would I? There's a mob forming in town," he cut her off. "They're coming tonight to persuade you to leave. From what I gathered, persuasion involves burning you out at minimum." The blood drained from Delilah's face. "They wouldn't dare." "Men wearing masks dare many things they wouldn't do in daylight," Isaac replied, already moving toward the cabin. "Do you have a wagon, horse?" No, father's horses were sold to cover his medical debts. She followed him, mind racing. "I can't just leave. This is my home, my father's land." Isaac turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Wright, Delilah, I understand what this place means to you, but land isn't worth your life. And where would I go? My aunt in Denver hasn't answered my letters in years. I have $23 to my name." "I know a place," he said after a moment's hesitation. "Old trading post about 2 days' ride from here. Man who runs it owes me a favor. You'd be safe there until you decide your next move." Delilah stared at him, trying to understand why this virtual stranger would append his own plans to help her. "Your man, Silas Vaughn, what about him?" "Vaughn can wait a few more days. He's not going anywhere I can't find him." Isaac's voice hardened. "But I won't ride away knowing what's coming for you tonight." The sincerity in his eyes broke through her resistance. With a nod, she hurried inside and began gathering her most precious possessions, her mother's locket, her father's Bible, a few books, the photograph of her parents on their wedding day, and the meager savings she kept hidden beneath a floorboard. Isaac helped her pack everything onto his horse, securing her small trunk behind the saddle. As dusk approached, Delilah took one last look at the cabin that had been her home for all of her 26 years. "We'll circle wide around town," Isaac said, helping her mount behind him. "With luck, they won't realize you're gone until they reach your place. And then they'll search, but we'll have too much of a head start." He glanced back at her. "You'll need to hold tight." Delilah nodded, tentatively placing her hands at his waist as the horse began to move. They rode in silence as twilight deepened around them, taking a winding path through the hills to avoid the main road. When darkness fell completely, Isaac pushed the horse harder, and Delilah found herself pressed against his back, arms circling him fully now for stability. "They called me Unholy," she said suddenly, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Because I taught the children that God's love doesn't stop at the edge of town, because I wouldn't let the reverend put his hands on me." Isaac didn't slow the horse, but she felt him stiffen slightly. "Men like that use religion to control what they fear, and nothing frightens them more than a woman with her own mind." They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and drink from Isaac's canteen. By dawn, they were deep in territory Delilah had never seen, though it was only a day's ride from the place she'd never left. "We'll rest here," Isaac decided as they reached a small creek sheltered by cottonwoods. "Horse needs water and grain, and you need sleep." Too exhausted to argue, Delilah dismounted stiffly, her legs nearly buckling after the long ride. Isaac steadied her with a hand at her elbow, the brief contact sending an unexpected warmth through her despite her fatigue. While he tended to the horse, she washed her face in the creek, the cool water reviving her somewhat. When she returned to their makeshift camp, Isaac had laid out a bedroll for her. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it's better than bare ground." "Thank you," she said, suddenly shy in this strange new situation. "For everything," he nodded, busying himself with gathering wood for a small fire. "Get some sleep, I'll keep watch." "Aren't you tired too?" "I've gone longer without rest," he replied with a slight smile. Advantage of a misspent youth. Delilah wanted to ask more about his youth, about the man he hunted, about the life that had given him both the skills to track a killer and the compassion to help a stranger, but exhaustion overtook her before she could form the questions. She lay down on the bedroll and was asleep within moments. When she woke, the sun was high overhead. Isaac sat with his back against a tree, cleaning his revolver with practiced movements. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, sitting up quickly. "About 6 hours," he replied, reassembling the weapon. "You needed it. So do you?" She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I can keep watch while you rest." He seemed about to refuse, then nodded. "Wake me in 2 hours. We should move on before dusk." Delilah watched as he stretched out on the ground, using his saddle as a pillow. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened, though she noticed his hand remained near his holstered gun even in sleep. What kind of life had taught him such wariness? While he slept, she explored their small sanctuary, gathering berries she recognized as safe and refilling the canteens with fresh creek water. The simple tasks helped calm her mind, which kept returning to the reality of her situation: homeless, nearly penniless, and dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew. Yet something about Isaac Blackburn inspired trust. Perhaps it was the way he'd immediately offered help without expectation of reward. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which he carried himself, or the absence of the predatory gaze she'd grown too accustomed to from men. Or perhaps, she admitted to herself, it was the unexpected flutter in her chest when he looked at her with those clear blue eyes. 2 hours later, almost to the minute, Isaac woke without her prompting. He sat up, instantly alert, scanning their surroundings before his gaze settled on her. "Everything quiet?" he asked, reaching for the canteen. "Not a soul has passed," she confirmed, offering him the berries she'd gathered. "These grow along the creek bank." He accepted them with a nod of thanks. "You know your plants." "My mother taught me before she passed." Said a woman should always be able to feed herself from what grows wild, just in case. Wise woman. He ate a handful of berries, then began repacking their few supplies. "We should cover another 15 miles before dark. Trading post is still a full day's ride." "Isaac," she said hesitantly, "I need to know what to expect at this trading post. What kind of favor does this man owe you?" He paused in his work, considering her question. 3 years ago, I stopped a robbery at his place. 2 men shot, one of them Clyde Miller, his wife's brother. Law would have hanged him, but I testified it was self-defense. It wasn't entirely, but Clyde had a new baby at home and no previous trouble with the law. So he owes you his life. In a manner of speaking, he and Sarah run the trading post together now. Good people, despite that one bad decision. They'll give you honest work if you want it, a place to stay until you figure out your next step. The thoughtfulness of his planning touched her. "And what about you? Will you continue your hunt once I'm settled?" Something shifted in his expression. "That's the plan." "What did this Silas Vaughn do?" she asked carefully. To earn such dedication, Isaac secured the last of their supplies before answering. "He killed my wife." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Delilah felt the sudden foolishness of her earlier thoughts, the flutter of attraction now inappropriate in the face of his loss. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. 3 years ago next month," he continued, his voice controlled but tight, "we had a small ranch in Texas. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Vaughn and his men came through looking for easy pickings. I was in town selling cattle when I returned." He trailed off, jaw clenching. "You don't need to tell me more." "No, I don't," he agreed, meeting her eyes. But I want you to understand why I can't stop until I find him, why I need to finish this." Delilah nodded slowly. "I understand vengeance, Isaac. I just hope it brings you the peace you're seeking." "It's not vengeance," he corrected her. "It's justice. No lawman will cross 3 territories to find him. It has to be me." Before she could respond, he was mounting the horse and extending his hand to help her up. The moment for deeper conversation had passed, and they rode on in silence as the afternoon stretched before them. That night, they made camp in the shelter of a rocky overhang. Isaac built a small fire and they shared the last of his jerky and hardtack. The silence between them had softened throughout the day, becoming companionable rather than strained. "Tell me about your life before redemption springs turned against you," Isaac said as they sat beside the fire. "What made you become a teacher?" Delilah smiled, warming to the subject. "I always loved learning. My father encouraged it, even when others thought it improper for a girl to be too educated. When the town needed a teacher 6 years ago, he convinced them to give me a chance. And they did. Reluctantly, yes. There weren't many options in such a small town, and I had more schooling than most. The children were wonderful, eager to learn, full of questions. I tried to teach them to think for themselves, to question the world around them." Her smile faded. "That was my mistake, I suppose." "Teaching children to think isn't a mistake," Isaac said firmly. "It's the greatest gift you could give them." Reverend Michaels disagreed. He said a woman's role was to instill obedience, not independent thought. She stared into the fire. "When I refused his proposal last spring, he began questioning my methods, my morality, even my faith. And the town believed him. Most did. He's been their spiritual leader for 15 years, she sighed. "A few parents stood by me at first, but eventually the pressure became too great. By summer's end, my classroom was empty." Isaac's expression darkened. "Men who use power to punish women who refuse them are cowards of the worst sort." "I've had months to come to terms with it," Delilah said, though the pain in her voice belied her words. "What hurts most isn't losing my position, it's knowing those children will grow up believing what they've been told about me, that I'm somehow corrupt, unholy." Isaac was silent for a long moment, watching the flames dance. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're not unholy, Delilah," he said softly. "You're one of the few truly good people I've met in 3 years of traveling through the worst this country has to offer." The simple conviction in his voice brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them away, unable to respond past the sudden tightness in her throat. "We should get some rest," he continued, oblivious to the effect his words had on her. "I'll take first watch again." Delilah nodded, retreating to the bedroll he'd again insisted she take. As she drifted towards sleep, she found herself studying his profile against the firelight, wondering what kind of woman had won the heart of such a man, and feeling an unexpected pang of jealousy toward a ghost. The trading post appeared on the horizon late the following afternoon, a cluster of low buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade, with smoke rising from several chimneys. As they approached, Delilah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. This would be her sanctuary, but it would also mean parting from Isaac. "Rider approaching?" A voice called from the walls as they neared the gate. "It's Isaac Blackburn," Isaac shouted back. "Tell Clyde I've come to collect that favor." There was a moment's pause, then the gate swung open to reveal a stocky man with a thick beard and a rifle held casually in one hand. His stern expression broke into a wide grin when he recognized Isaac. "Blackburn, you son of a gun," he called, striding forward. "Sarah said she had a feeling we'd be seeing you again." The men clasped hands warmly before Clyde's attention turned to Delilah. His eyebrows rose in question. "This is Miss Delilah Wright," Isaac explained. "She's in need of safe harbor for a time." Clyde's expression grew serious as he took in her travel-worn appearance. "Any friend of Blackburn's is welcome here, miss. Sarah will be pleased to have another woman around. Place gets lonely with just the 2 of us and the occasional trader passing through." "You're very kind," Delilah replied, dismounting with Isaac's help. Her legs were stiff from 2 days in the saddle, and she wobbled slightly as she stood. "Let's get you both inside," Clyde said, leading them through the gate. "Sarah's got stew on and there's hot water for washing up." The interior of the trading post was a revelation. What had looked modest from the outside revealed itself as a well-organized compound with a main trading building, several storage structures, and a comfortable 2-story house. Everything was clean and well-maintained, speaking to the prosperity of the operation. Sarah Miller proved to be a tall, capable-looking woman with kind eyes and premature silver threading through her dark hair. She welcomed Delilah with genuine warmth, showing her to a small but clean bedroom while Isaac and Clyde unloaded her few possessions. "It's not much," Sarah apologized, "but it's private and yours for as long as you need it." "It's perfect," Delilah assured her, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed. Any debt we owe is to Isaac." Sarah studied her thoughtfully. "Though I admit I'm curious how you came to be traveling with him." "He's not one for companions in our experience." Delilah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "He helped me when I needed it most. Saved me, really." Sarah nodded, seeming to understand there was more to the story but not pressing. "That sounds like him." Man can't help playing the hero, even when he's pretending to be just passing through. After washing away the dust of travel with blissfully warm water, Delilah joined the others for dinner in the main house's comfortable kitchen. The conversation flowed easily, with Clyde and Sarah sharing news of the territory, and Isaac occasionally contributing details from his travels. Throughout the meal, Delilah found her gaze returning to Isaac, trying to memorize his features, the sound of his rare laugh, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. Tomorrow he would leave, continuing his pursuit of Silas Vaughn, and she might never see him again. The thought brought an unexpected ache to her chest. After dinner, while Sarah showed Delilah the trading post's small library, Isaac and Clyde stepped outside to speak privately. When they returned, something had changed in Isaac's demeanor, a new tension in his shoulders, a focused intensity in his eyes. "Clyde's heard rumors," he told Delilah when they had a moment alone. "Vaughn was seen 2 days' ride north of here, headed toward the Colorado border." "You're leaving in the morning," she guessed, fighting to keep disappointment from her voice. "First light," he confirmed. "If I push hard, I can make up the time we lost." Delilah nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course. You've already delayed your search to help me. I can't ask for more." "Delilah." He seemed to struggle for words. "You'll be safe here. Clyde and Sarah are good people. They've agreed to let you stay as long as you need, help you find work if that's what you want." "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." He held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Clyde called him away to discuss supplies for his journey, and the moment was lost. That night, alone in her new room, Delilah tried to reconcile the tumult of emotions within her. Gratitude for her rescue, grief for the life she'd left behind, uncertainty about her future, and beneath it all, a growing affection for a man bound to a quest of vengeance. She understood his need to find Vaughn, to bring justice for his wife's murder. How could she not? But understanding didn't ease the hollowness she felt at the thought of his departure. Sleep eluded her, and when the first hint of dawn lightened the sky, she rose and dressed quickly. Making her way quietly downstairs, she found Isaac already in the kitchen, checking his supplies one last time. He looked up at her entrance, surprise flickering across his features. "You're up early." "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she admitted. "Not in front of everyone." Isaac nodded, straightening from his task. In the soft light of early morning, his face seemed younger, the lines of weariness less pronounced. "I've left money with Clyde," he said. "Enough to get you to Denver if you decide that's where you want to go. You didn't have to do that, I know." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I want you to have options, Delilah, a chance to build a new life." "And what about you?" she asked, meeting his gaze steadily. "After you find Vaughn, if you find him, what then?" I haven't thought much beyond that day, he admitted. For 3 years, finding him has been all that mattered. And when it's done, when justice is served, she took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Would you consider coming back here? The question hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Isaac's expression softened and he reached out slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. I can't make promises, Delilah, not with Vaughn still out there. I understand, she said, trying to hide her disappointment. I just wanted you to know. There would be a welcome waiting if you chose to return. Something changed in his eyes, then a flicker of longing quickly suppressed. When this is finished, he said carefully, I'll need to make peace with more than just Vaughn's ghost. Before she could respond, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead in a gesture so tender it nearly broke her composure. Stay safe, he whispered against her skin. Remember what I said, you're not what they called you. Never believe that. Then he was gone, collecting his supplies and stepping into the growing light. Delilah followed him to the stables, watching as he saddled his horse with efficient movements. Clyde joined them, passing Isaac a packet of provisions and exchanging a few quiet words. As Isaac mounted, he looked down at Delilah one last time. They told me I'm unholy, she said softly, repeating the words that had driven her from her home. Isaac's gaze held hers, intense and unwavering. Then I'll be your prayer, he whispered, the unexpected sentiment making her heart swell. With a final nod to Clyde, he turned his horse toward the gate and rode out, the rising sun silhouetting him against the eastern sky. Delilah watched until he disappeared from view, his last words echoing in her mind. Then, squaring her shoulders, she turned back toward the trading post, toward whatever new life awaited her there. The days at the trading post stretched into weeks, and Delilah gradually found her place within its rhythms. Sarah welcomed her help in managing the books and inventory, discovering that Delilah's education made her invaluable for such tasks. Clyde taught her to shoot properly, not just to frighten away intruders as she'd done before, but to hit what she aimed at consistently. Never know when you might need it out here, he'd said gruffly when she protested that she'd never killed anything larger than a rabbit. World's changing, but it's still wild in these parts. Traders and travelers pass through regularly, bringing news and goods from distant settlements. Delilah found herself listening eagerly for any mention of a man matching Isaac's description or rumors of Silas Vaughn, but none came. At night, alone in her room, she would sometimes take out the small Bible her father had left her and run her fingers over the worn leather cover. Though her faith had been tested by the cruelty of those who claimed to serve God, she found comfort in the familiar passages, especially those that spoke of justice, mercy, and love. Love. The word both comforted and troubled her. In the quiet moments between tasks, when her mind was free to wander, it inevitably turned to Isaac, to the strength in his hands and the gentleness in his touch, to the determination in his stride and the rare softness in his smile. Was it foolish to feel such attachment to a man she'd known so briefly? A man whose heart still belonged, at least in part, to a woman 3 years dead. A man who might never return from his dangerous quest. You're thinking about him again, Sarah observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Delilah didn't bother denying it. In the weeks of living together, she and Sarah had developed an easy friendship built on mutual respect and shared confidences. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's felt the same way, Sarah replied with a small smile. I waited 4 years for Clyde to notice me as more than his sister's friend. At least you knew where he was, Delilah sighed. Isaac could be anywhere by now. He could be. She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. That man's harder to kill than a bad rumor, Clyde said, joining them on the porch with 3 cups of coffee. If anyone can find Vaughn alive to tell about it, it's Blackburn. You knew him before his wife died, Delilah asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. Clyde nodded, settling into a chair beside his wife. Met him when he was still a Texas Ranger. Different man back then, lighter somehow, despite the badge. That changed after Rebecca was killed. Rebecca, Delilah repeated softly. It was the first time she'd heard Isaac's wife's name. Pretty woman, smart as a whip, Sarah added. They were only married a year when it happened. Barely had time to start their life together before Vaughn destroyed it. The image of a faceless woman named Rebecca haunted Delilah's dreams that night, a woman who had known Isaac in ways Delilah could only imagine, who had seen the man he was before grief and vengeance reshaped him. Morning brought unexpected excitement to the trading post. A large wagon train stopped to resupply on its way to California, bringing nearly 30 people into the compound. Delilah found herself busy helping Sarah tend to the sudden influx of customers, many of whom were eager for news of the territories ahead. Among the travelers was a young woman named Emily Thornton, traveling west with her brother to start a new life after losing their parents to influenza. Emily took an immediate liking to Delilah, and they spent what spare moments they had sharing stories of their very different lives. "I can't imagine staying in one place your whole life," Emily marveled as they sorted goods for the wagon train's purchase. "I've been dreaming of California since I was a girl, and I never thought I'd leave Redemption Springs," Delilah replied with a wry smile. "Yet here I am." "Do you think you'll go back once the gossip dies down?" Delilah considered the question. "No," she said finally. "There's nothing for me there now. My father's gone, the school doesn't want me. I need to build something new." "You could come with us to California," Emily suggested, eyes brightening. "They say women can make their own way there, especially educated ones like you. You could start a new school." The offer was tempting a chance for a completely fresh start in a place where no one knew her history. Yet something held her back, a pull she couldn't quite explain but which anchored her to this trading post. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "but I think my path lies elsewhere." Emily studied her face for a moment, then smiled knowingly. "There's a man, isn't there, someone you're waiting for?" "It's complicated," Delilah admitted, feeling her cheeks warm. "The best ones always are," Emily laughed. "Well, I hope he's worthy of such loyalty." The wagon train departed 2 days later, leaving the trading post feeling strangely empty despite returning to its normal population of 3. As Delilah helped Sarah clean up the aftermath of their busy visitors, she found herself contemplating Emily's words. Was she truly waiting for Isaac? And if so, for how long? "Letter came for you," Clyde announced that evening, holding out a slightly crumpled envelope. Ryder from Fort Collins brought it. Delilah took it with trembling fingers, recognizing neither the handwriting nor any possible correspondent. Opening it carefully, she unfolded a single sheet of paper containing just a few lines. "D. Vaughn crossed into Wyoming territory. Following close. You were right about prayer." Her heart raced as she read the brief message again and again. It told her almost nothing, yet it meant everything. He was alive, still pursuing his quarry, and he had thought of her enough to send word. Good news. Sarah asked, noting Delilah's brightened expression. "He's alive," Delilah replied simply, clutching the letter to her chest. The months that followed brought changes to the trading post and to Delilah herself. Spring arrived with new growth and increased traffic along the trail, bringing more business and occasionally more news. A second letter arrived in April, even shorter than the first. D. Still searching. Think of you often. I. In May, a U.S. Marshall passing through mentioned pursuing a gang that had robbed a bank in Cheyenne. The description of one of the outlaws tall with a distinctive facial scar made Delilah's breath catch. When she pressed for more details, the marshal shrugged. Last seen heading toward Montana territory. Nasty piece of work, that Vaughn. 3 men dead in the robbery, including a young deputy. Delilah shared the information with Clyde and Sarah that night, her concern evident. If Isaac is still following him, he's walking into serious danger, Clyde finished grimly. Vaughn's picked up new men since I last heard by the sound of it. Is there any way to warn him? Delilah asked. Not unless you know exactly where he is, Sarah replied, squeezing her hand sympathetically. All we can do is pray he's being careful. Prayer had once been simple for Delilah, a comforting ritual taught by her father, practiced in church and school in private moments. Reverend Michaels had tainted that, turning faith into a weapon against her. But now, facing the possibility of Isaac confronting a murderer and his gang alone, she found herself returning to those familiar words and rhythms, seeking solace in their timeless cadence. June arrived with sweltering heat and the unexpected appearance of a traveling preacher. Unlike Reverend Michaels with his fire and brimstone sermons, Reverend Thomas Wells was a gentle-spoken man who emphasized compassion above judgment. When he asked permission to hold a Sunday service at the trading post for travelers and locals alike, Delilah initially kept her distance. "I understand your hesitation," the Reverend said when Sarah explained Delilah's history. "The Lord's name has been used to justify great cruelties throughout history. Some would say I'm beyond salvation," Delilah replied, testing his reaction. The old man smiled kindly. "In my experience, Miss Wright, those who believe themselves beyond salvation are often closer to God's heart than those who proclaim their righteousness from the pulpit." His simple wisdom reminded her of her father's faith, quiet, steadfast, and centered on love rather than fear. When Sunday came, Delilah found herself attending the service, sitting slightly apart from the small gathering of traders and travelers but present nonetheless. Reverend Wells spoke not of sin and damnation, but of hope and renewal. "The wilderness has always been where God's people find their way back to Him," he said, gesturing to the vast landscape surrounding them. "Moses in the desert, Jesus in the wilderness, it is in these places of solitude and challenge that we often hear God's voice most clearly." His words resonated with Delilah's own journey, forced from her home into an uncertain future, yet finding unexpected strength, and perhaps even purpose in her exile. For the first time since leaving Redemption Springs, she felt a sense of peace about her circumstances, a growing conviction that this path, however difficult, was leading her where she needed to go. After the service, as people dispersed to their various destinations, Reverend Wells approached her. "Something tells me you've been carrying a heavy burden, Miss Wright. Would you care to walk with me a while?" They strolled along the perimeter of the trading post, and Delilah found herself sharing her story, the accusations, the ostracism, her rescue by Isaac, and her uncertain future. "And this man, Isaac, you care for him," the Reverend observed gently. "Yes," she admitted, the simple truth feeling both terrifying and liberating to speak aloud. "But he's bound to a path of vengeance that may destroy him, even if he succeeds." "Vengeance and justice often look similar from a distance," Reverend Wells said thoughtfully, "but they lead the soul to very different destinations." "I fear for him," Delilah confessed, "not just his physical safety but his spirit." "What happens to a man who achieves the revenge he sought for years? What fills the emptiness when that purpose is gone?" The Reverend nodded slowly. "A profound question. The Bible tells us vengeance belongs to the Lord, not because God is jealous of the power, but because humans weren't created to bear its weight. It consumes us from within. So there's no hope for him, for us." The last word emerged as barely more than a whisper. "There is always hope, my dear." "Always?" The old man's eyes crinkled kindly. "Perhaps you are already the answer to his redemption, just as he was the answer to your prayer for deliverance." The Reverend departed the next day, continuing his circuit of remote settlements, but his words stayed with Delilah. They gave form to the nebulous hope she'd been nurturing that somehow, when Isaac's quest ended, he might find his way back to her, back to a life beyond vengeance. Summer progressed, bringing increased traffic to the trading post and more responsibility for Delilah. Clyde, recognizing her head for figures and administration, gradually entrusted her with more of the business operations. Sarah, whose arthritis worsened in the humid summer heat, gratefully relinquished many of her duties to Delilah's capable hands. "You've become indispensable," Sarah told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "I don't know how we managed before you came." "You're only saying that because I let you sleep past dawn," Delilah teased, though she was touched by the comment. "Partly," Sarah admitted with a laugh. "But mostly because you've brought life back to this place. Even Clyde smiles more these days." It was true that Delilah had introduced changes to the trading post, organizing the inventory more efficiently. Starting a small garden that now provided fresh vegetables, even establishing a tiny lending library for travelers who passed through. The work gave her purpose, a sense of building something meaningful even as she waited for news of Isaac. But waiting no longer adequately described her state of mind. Yes, she thought of Isaac daily, wondered about his safety, and hoped for his return. But she was also living fully in the present, creating a place for herself in this new world. July brought a third letter, this one slightly longer and carried by a bounty hunter passing through. D. Vaughn surrounded himself with hired guns. 5 of them now. "Marshal Brady in Billings says he'll send men when he can spare them, but I can't wait. Keep me in your prayers." The word sent a chill through Delilah. 5 against 1 were odds that even the most skilled gunman couldn't hope to overcome. Isaac was walking into a slaughter, driven by a need for justice that had become an obsession. That night, she wrote her first reply, though she had no way of knowing if it would reach him. "Isaac, do not face them alone. Your life is worth more than vengeance. There is a future waiting for you when justice is done if you choose to claim it. I will pray, but please be careful. Come back." Delilah, she gave the letter to a territorial marshal passing through the next day, with instructions to deliver it to any lawman in Billings who might know of Isaac Blackburn's whereabouts. It was a slim chance, but it was all she had. August arrived with brutal heat, and the surprising appearance of a young Cheyenne woman named Morning Star, who arrived at the trading post injured and exhausted. She spoke broken English, but managed to convey that she had escaped from men who had attacked her village, white men looking for someone. Delilah and Sarah tended her wounds while Clyde stood guard, concerned that her pursuers might follow her trail to the trading post. As Morning Star recovered her strength, her English improved enough to share more details. 5 men, she explained, her dark eyes intense. Led by one with marked face. She traced a line down her right cheek. "They come to village, ask about man who tracks them. When no one answer, they burn lodge, take food." "A man tracking them?" Delilah asked, heart racing. "Did they describe him?" Morning Star nodded. "Tall man, blue eyes, scar here." She touched her hairline. "They offer gold for him, dead. Isaac, it had to be. Vaughn knew he was being hunted and had turned the tables, making the hunter into the hunted." "Where did this happen?" Clyde pressed. "How far from here?" 3 days north, Morning Star replied. "Near Big River." Clyde consulted his maps that evening, trying to pinpoint the location. "Could be near the mussel shell," he told Delilah and Sarah grimly. "If so, Blackburn's in trouble. That's rough country, easy to get cornered." "We have to warn him," Delilah insisted. "Send riders, get word to the marshal something." "I've already sent Tomas to alert the authorities in Fort Benton," Clyde assured her. "But it'll take time, and we don't know exactly where either Vaughn or Isaac is now." "Then I'll go," she said, the decision crystallizing in her mind. "Morning Star can guide me to where she last saw them." "Absolutely not," Sarah interrupted. "It's too dangerous. More dangerous than staying here if Vaughn's men follow Morning Star's trail," Delilah countered. "At least out there we have a chance of finding Isaac, warning him about the ambush." The argument continued into the night, but Delilah remained resolute. By morning, a compromise had been reached. Clyde would accompany Delilah and Morning Star, along with 2 reliable men who often worked as scouts for the trading post. They would attempt to locate Isaac and warn him, while staying well clear of Vaughn and his gang. 3 days to find him, Clyde stipulated as they prepared to depart. "Then we turn back, regardless. Sarah needs me here, and I won't leave her vulnerable longer than necessary." Delilah agreed, understanding the risk he was taking on her behalf. As she mounted the sturdy mare Clyde had given her in the spring, she felt a strange mixture of terror and determination. She had never been so far from civilization, never undertaken such a dangerous journey. Yet the thought of Isaac facing ambush alone drove her forward. The landscape grew wilder as they rode north, following game trails and shallow creek beds to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Morning Star proved an invaluable guide, her knowledge of the terrain and ability to read subtle signs of passage helping them make good time. On the second day, they found evidence of recent violence, a small Cheyenne encampment with charred remains of lodges and scattered possessions. No bodies were visible, suggesting the survivors had fled or buried their dead before departing. "Vaughn's work," Clyde said grimly, surveying the destruction. "Getting more desperate and more dangerous." Morning Star moved silently through the ruins, occasionally picking up objects and replacing them with murmured words that sounded like prayers. When she rejoined them, her expression was somber but determined. "Man, you seek past here," she said to Delilah. "2 days ago, following them?" She pointed northwest toward distant hills that shimmered in the afternoon heat. They made camp that night in a sheltered ravine, keeping their fire small and posting watches throughout the dark hours. Delilah found sleep elusive, her mind filled with images of Isaac pursuing killers who were now hunting him in return. Dawn brought a new determination as they continued northwest, following signs that Morning Star insisted indicated recent passage of a lone rider. By midday, the landscape had changed to rocky hills interspersed with stands of pine and juniper, perfect territory for an ambush. It was Delilah who spotted the horse first, a familiar bay grazing in a small meadow nestled between rocky outcroppings. Her heart leapt as she recognized Isaac's mount, though there was no sign of the man himself. Approaching cautiously, they found evidence of a hasty camp, cold ashes of a small fire, a bedroll partially concealed beneath a juniper, and tracks leading toward a rocky ridge to the west. "He's scouting," Clyde surmised, studying the signs. "Probably spotted Vaughn's camp and is planning his approach, or walking into their trap," Delilah said, fear sharpening her voice. "We need to find him now." Leaving one man with the horses and Morning Star, Clyde and Delilah followed the tracks up the ridge, moving as quietly as possible over the rocky ground. As they neared the crest, Clyde motioned for Delilah to stay low and pointed to a narrow gap between 2 boulders. "Look there, but keep your head down," he whispered. Delilah crept forward and peered through the gap. Below them stretched a small valley with a creek running through its center. Near the water stood a crude camp, 4 horses picketed nearby, a fire burning, and 3 men visible. Of Isaac there was no sign. "Where are the others?" she whispered to Clyde, who had joined her at the vantage point. "Can't see them," he replied tersely, "but they're here somewhere, probably keeping watch." As if to confirm his assessment, a glint of metal caught Delilah's eye, sunlight reflecting off a rifle barrel positioned among rocks on the far side of the valley. Another watcher was barely visible in the shadow of a large pine to the north. "It's an ambush," she breathed. "They know he's coming." "And he's walking right into it," Clyde agreed grimly. "We need to warn him, but first we need to find." The sound of a gun being cocked behind them froze the words in his throat. They turned slowly to find themselves facing a tall, bearded man with a revolver pointed directly at them. "Well now," the man drawled, a cruel smile spreading beneath his unkempt beard. "What have we here?" "Reinforcements for our friend Blackburn." Before either could respond, the man whistled sharply, alerting his companions below. Clyde tensed, clearly considering whether to go for his own weapon, but the gunman shook his head. "I wouldn't," he advised. "Not unless you want the lady to catch the first bullet." "We're just passing through," Clyde tried, raising his hands slowly. "Don't want any trouble." "Bit late for that," the man replied. "Hands behind your backs, both of you. We're going to have a little chat with Silas." Heart pounding, Delilah complied as the man bound their wrists with rough rope. Silas Vaughn, the monster who had murdered Isaac's wife, who had burned villages and robbed banks and left a trail of bodies across 3 territories, was waiting for them below. As they were marched down the hillside toward the camp, Delilah scanned desperately for any sign of Isaac, praying he was watching, that he would see the trap before it closed around him as well. The man waiting by the fire stood as they approached, tall and lean, with an unmistakable scar running down his right cheek and cold eyes that assessed them with calculating interest. Silas Vaughn looked exactly as Delilah had imagined in her nightmares, and somehow worse in the flesh. "What you find, Burke?" he called to their captor. "Couple of nosy neighbors," Burke replied, shoving them forward. "Found them watching from the ridge." Vaughn studied them, his gaze lingering on Delilah in a way that made her skin crawl. "You're a long way from anywhere, folks." "What brings you to my temporary home?" "Hunting," Clyde answered before Delilah could speak. "Saw your smoke, got curious." "Curious," Vaughn repeated, clearly not believing a word. "And armed for?" "What exactly?" "Bears, mountain lions," Clyde replied steadily. "Been taking calves from ranches south of here." Vaughn smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "You know what I think? I think our friend Blackburn sent you ahead to scout, maybe draw us out." His gaze shifted to Delilah. "Though I admit, sending a woman is an unusual tactic." "We don't know anyone named Blackburn," Delilah said, struggling to keep her voice even. "Please, we're just travelers." "Search their saddlebags," Vaughn ordered one of his men. "Let's see if their story holds up." The minutes that followed stretched like hours as they stood under Vaughn's cold scrutiny. Delilah tried to control her breathing, to hide the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. If Isaac appeared now, he'd be riding into death. The man returned with their saddlebags, dumping the contents on the ground. Among Delilah's possessions was the letter she had written to Isaac, which the man handed to Vaughn with a triumphant smirk. "Well, well," Vaughn said after reading it. "Isaac, do not face them alone." "Seems you know our persistent friend quite well, madam." His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Perhaps intimately." Delilah held his gaze, refusing to show weakness despite the terror coursing through her. "He saved my life once. I'm trying to return the favor." "Noble," Vaughn commented, tucking the letter into his pocket. "And convenient for me. It seems Blackburn's weakness for damsels in distress hasn't changed." He turned to his men. "Tie them to those trees where they'll be visible from the ridge. Our friend will be along soon enough." As they were secured to separate pine trees at the edge of the camp, Delilah caught Clyde's eye. His expression was grim but determined, silently communicating that they needed to stay alert for any opportunity. The afternoon waned, shadows lengthening across the valley as Vaughn's men maintained their watch positions. Occasionally one would report in, confirming no sign of Blackburn yet, but Vaughn seemed unconcerned by the delay. "He'll come," he assured his increasingly restless men. "Man's been hunting me for 3 years. Won't stop now, especially with such appealing bait." As dusk approached, Delilah's fear gave way to a strange calm. If these were to be her final hours, she wouldn't spend them trembling. Instead, she began to pray not the formal prayers of church services, but simple, direct appeals for courage, for Clyde's safety, and for Isaac to somehow sense the trap awaiting him. The first shot came just as twilight deepened the shadows beneath the trees, a single rifle report that echoed through the valley. One of Vaughn's lookouts pitched forward from his hiding place among the rocks, dead before he hit the ground. "Positions." Vaughn barked, drawing his revolver and ducking behind a large boulder. "He's here." The camp erupted into chaos as the remaining men scrambled for cover. A second shot took down another of Vaughn's gang, this one positioned in a tree on the valley's eastern edge. "Where is he?" Burke shouted, firing blindly toward the ridge. "Everywhere and nowhere," Clyde murmured to Delilah, a note of admiration in his voice. "Man knows what he's doing." For the next several minutes, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the nervous shifting of Vaughn's remaining men. 2 dead in as many minutes, with no clear indication of where the shots had come from. The psychological effect was devastating, exactly as Isaac had intended. "Show yourself, Blackburn," Vaughn finally called out, frustration evident in his voice. "Or I start putting bullets in your friends." To emphasize his point, he fired a shot that splintered the bark inches from Delilah's head. She flinched but remained silent, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her fear. "You have until the count of 3, Vaughn continued. 1, 2. I'm here, Vaughn." The voice came from directly behind the camp, where no one had been watching. Isaac stepped into the firelight, his revolver held steady at his side, expression calm despite the 3 guns now trained on him. "Drop the gun," Vaughn ordered, slowly. Isaac complied, his gaze briefly meeting Delilah's across the camp. The emotions that passed between them in that moment were too complex for words' relief: fear, apology, and something deeper that neither had dared name. "3 years I've been looking for you," Isaac said, turning his attention back to Vaughn. 3 years since you murdered my wife. Business, nothing personal," Vaughn replied with a shrug. "Though I will admit she put up quite a fight. Spirited woman, your Rebecca." The deliberate cruelty of the words made Delilah flinch, but Isaac's expression remained unnervingly calm. "It ends today, Vaughn, one way or another." "Indeed it does," Vaughn agreed, gesturing to his men. "Bind him. We'll take our time with this one." As Burke approached with rope, Isaac stood motionless, seemingly resigned to his fate. Only Delilah, watching closely, noticed the slight tensing of his muscles, the subtle shift in his stance. The moment Burke reached for his wrists, Isaac exploded into action. A hidden knife appeared in his hand, slashing across Burke's throat in a single fluid motion. As the man fell, Isaac dropped and rolled, retrieving Burke's fallen revolver and firing twice in rapid succession. One of Vaughn's remaining men crumpled, a neat hole appearing in the center of his forehead. The other returned fire wildly, bullets kicking up dirt as Isaac dove behind a stack of firewood. Vaughn, momentarily stunned by the sudden reversal, recovered quickly and aimed his gun not at Isaac but at Delilah. "Enough," he shouted. "Drop the gun or she dies." Isaac froze, his gaze locking with Delilah's across the chaotic camp. In that moment of connection, something passed between them, a wordless understanding, a shared resolve. Delilah gave the slightest nod, then suddenly dropped her weight against the ropes binding her, creating just enough slack to duck her head to the side. In the same instant, Isaac fired, his bullet passing inches from her to strike Vaughn in the shoulder. The impact spun Vaughn around, his own shot going wide. Before he could recover, Isaac was on him, tackling him to the ground. The men rolled in the dirt, struggling for control of Vaughn's weapon. Meanwhile, the last of Vaughn's gang turned his attention to Delilah and Clyde, seemingly deciding that killing the hostages was his best remaining option. As he raised his gun toward Delilah, a rifle shot rang out from the trees, dropping him instantly. Morning Star emerged from the shadows, rifle in hand, moving quickly to cut Clyde and Delilah free. "Just in time," Clyde said with grim approval as he rubbed circulation back into his wrists. "Never thought I'd be so glad to see someone disobey orders." "Saw bad men," Morning Star replied simply. "Came to help." Delilah barely registered the exchange, her attention fixed on the brutal struggle continuing near the fire. Isaac and Vaughn were still locked together, each fighting for survival with desperate intensity. Then came the sound Delilah had been dreading, a gunshot at close range, followed by sudden stillness. For a terrible moment, she couldn't tell who had fired, who had been hit. Both men lay motionless on the blood-soaked ground. Then Isaac stirred, pushing himself up slowly, one hand pressed to his side where crimson spread across his shirt. Beneath him, Vaughn lay still, eyes open but seeing nothing, a revolver still clutched in his lifeless hand. "Isaac?" Delilah ran to him as he swayed unsteadily to his feet. "You shouldn't be here," he said weakly, even as he leaned into her support. "Why did you come?" "To save you," she replied, guiding him to a fallen log. "Though you seem to have managed well enough on your own." Not entirely on my own, he acknowledged with a pained smile, nodding toward Morning Star and Clyde, who were already checking the bodies to ensure no threats remained. As Delilah tore strips from her petticoat to bind his wound, Isaac studied her face with a strange expression, part wonder, part disbelief. "I got your letter," he said softly. "Yesterday, at a trading post 2 days' ride from here. It's why I changed my approach, came in more carefully." "Thank God for that," she replied, focusing on her task to hide the tears threatening to spill. "His bullet would have found your heart otherwise." "I think something else found it first," Isaac murmured, his hand capturing hers as she worked. "Something I didn't expect to find again." Their eyes met, and the connection between them seemed to transcend the chaos around them, the years of pain and loneliness each had endured. "They told me I'm unholy," Delilah whispered, repeating the words that had driven her from her home and into his path. Isaac's hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the blood staining his fingers. "Then I'll be your prayer," he replied, echoing the promise he'd made months before, "for as long as you'll have me." In the midst of death and violence, surrounded by the evidence of vengeance fulfilled, they found something neither had dared hope for: the possibility of beginning anew. Clyde approached, interrupting the moment with practical concerns. "We need to move," he said briskly. "Get that wound properly tended and put some distance between us and this mess before anyone else comes looking." "There's a cavalry outpost a day's ride east," Isaac suggested, wincing as he stood. "We can report what happened, let them handle the bodies." The journey back was slow and difficult, with frequent stops to tend Isaac's wound and rest the horses. Morning Star led them on a roundabout path that avoided open ground, wary of any remaining associates of Vaughn who might be in the area. During one of their rest periods, as Delilah changed Isaac's bandages beside a small creek, he finally asked the question that had clearly been troubling him. "You could have been killed coming after me," he said, watching her work with careful movements. "Why take such a risk?" Delilah continued her task, gathering courage before meeting his gaze. "For the same reason you spent 3 years hunting Vaughn," she answered finally. "Because some things are worth any risk. Vengeance isn't the same." As he stopped, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Love," she finished for him, the word hanging between them like a fragile, precious thing. "No, it isn't, but both can drive us to extremes we never thought ourselves capable of." Isaac was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his hand covered hers, stilling her movements. "Rebecca would have liked you," he said quietly. "She always said I needed someone who would challenge me, not just follow." "I wish I could have known her," Delilah replied honestly. "She must have been remarkable." "She was." A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "And she would be the first to tell me that living in the past is no way to honor her memory." He drew Delilah closer, their foreheads touching in an intimacy more profound than any kiss. "I've been half alive for 3 years," he murmured, "existing only to find Vaughn, now that it's done. I'm not sure I remember how to truly live." "We can learn together," she offered, her voice barely above a whisper, "day by day." His response was to close the distance between them, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of promise and possibility, tentative at first, then deepening as they each surrendered to feelings too long denied. When they finally reached the trading post 2 days later, Sarah rushed out to meet them, her relief at seeing Clyde unharmed quickly giving way to concern over Isaac's injury and questions about what had transpired. That evening, as Isaac rested in the room Sarah had prepared for him, Clyde shared the full story of their encounter with Vaughn and the fierce battle that had followed. "Man fought like he had angels at his back," Clyde concluded with grudging admiration. "Never seen anything like it." "Or demons at his heels," Sarah suggested, glancing toward the stairs. "The question now is, with Vaughn gone, what ghosts will haunt him next?" Delilah followed her gaze, thinking of the complicated journey that lay ahead for Isaac and for herself if they chose to walk it together. Revenge had sustained him for 3 years. Its absence would leave a void that needed filling with something life-affirming. In the days that followed, as Isaac recovered his strength, Delilah found moments to sit with him, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sharing comfortable silence. They spoke of the past his life as a Texas Ranger, her childhood in Redemption Springs, and cautiously, of possible futures. "I sold the ranch after Rebecca died," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. "Couldn't bear to stay there with the memories. Used the money to fund my search for Vaughn. And now," she asked gently, "now I have enough left to start over, buy some land maybe." He glanced at her, uncertainty in his eyes. "If that's something you might consider sharing." The tentative offer hung between them, freighted with meaning. Delilah considered her response carefully, aware that both their futures balanced on this moment. "I've been thinking," she said finally, "about what Reverend Wells told me about finding purpose in the wilderness, about hearing God's voice more clearly in places of challenge." Isaac listened intently, giving her the space to find her words. "This place has become home to me," she continued, gesturing to the trading post and the wild country beyond. "There are children scattered across these territories who have no access to education, families in isolated homesteads, mining camps, small settlements." "You're thinking of teaching again," he observed, a smile warming his features. "Not in a traditional school," she clarified, "but perhaps a circuit like the traveling preachers, a few weeks here, a month there, bringing books and learning to places that have none." "It would be a hard life," Isaac cautioned, "dangerous at times, always on the move." "Yes," she agreed, "but a meaningful one." She turned to face him fully, "And not one I'd have to face alone if you meant what you said." The tension in his shoulders eased, relief and something like joy spreading across his face. "I meant every word," he assured her, taking her hand in his. "Wherever you go, whatever path you choose, I want to walk it with you." 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Delilah stood beside Isaac before Reverend Wells in the trading post's small common room. Sarah had decorated the space with wildflowers and ribbons, while Clyde had arranged for musicians from a nearby settlement to provide music for the occasion. As she repeated her vows, Delilah caught glimpses of their future in Isaac's steady gaze, not the conventional life she'd once envisioned for herself, but something richer and more challenging. They would face hardships, certainly, as they traveled the territories bringing education to isolated communities. There would be dangers, prejudices, and setbacks to overcome. But they would face them together, each strengthening the other, each finding in their union something neither had expected to discover again: purpose, acceptance, and love unconstrained by society's narrow expectations. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Wells declared, beaming at the couple. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Isaac drew her into their first kiss as a married couple, Delilah felt the final shadows of Redemption Springs fall away. The accusations that had once seemed to define her unholy, corrupting, unworthy had no power in the face of this man's unwavering belief in her goodness. They had both been broken by loss and rejection, their faith in humanity shaken by cruelty disguised as righteousness. Yet somehow, in finding each other, they had discovered a way forward, not despite their wounds, but because of them. Their shared understanding of suffering had created a foundation for compassion, for growth, for love. "Ready for our adventure, Mrs. Blackburn?" Isaac murmured against her ear as they moved together in their first dance. "With you," Delilah smiled up at him, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. "Always." 2 years later, Delilah stood before a group of children in a mining camp nestled in the Colorado mountains. Behind her, Isaac finished repairs to the rough-hewn schoolhouse while keeping one eye on their daughter, Rebecca, who at 10 months old was determined to explore every inch of their temporary home. "Who can tell me about this constellation?" Delilah asked, pointing to a diagram in the astronomy book she'd brought from their well-stocked wagon, A young boy with dirt-smudged cheeks raised his hand tentatively. "That's the North Star, madam. My pa says it always shows the way home." "That's right, Thomas," she confirmed with a smile. "No matter where you are, no matter how lost you might feel, that star remains constant. Sailors have used it to navigate for centuries." As she continued the lesson, Delilah caught Isaac's gaze across the room. The peace in his eyes, the quiet contentment in his expression, mirrored what she felt in her own heart. They had found their North Star in each other, a constant point by which to navigate life's journey, a light that guided them home no matter how far they wandered. Their traveling school had visited 12 settlements in the past 2 years, staying anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months, depending on the need. Isaac supplemented their income by offering his skills as a carpenter and occasional lawman, while Delilah taught not just children but often adults eager to improve their reading or mathematics. They lived simply but richly, their wagon converted into a mobile home complete with a small stove, bookshelves, and a cradle for Rebecca. The communities they served often paid them in goods rather than money: fresh eggs, handcrafted furniture, winter coats sewn by grateful mothers. That evening, as Isaac rocked their daughter to sleep, Delilah sat at their small table writing in her journal. What had begun as a personal record had evolved into notes for the book she hoped to write someday, a guide for other traveling educators, sharing methods she developed for teaching children of different ages and backgrounds simultaneously. "She's finally asleep," Isaac whispered, carefully laying Rebecca in her cradle. "Stubborn girl, fought it the whole way." "Like her father," Delilah observed with a fond smile. "Or her mother," he countered, coming to stand behind her chair. His hands settled on her shoulders, kneading the tension from muscles stiff from a day of teaching. "You were wonderful today. The way you handled Thomas, most teachers would have given up on him months ago." "He reminds me of some boys I taught in Redemption Springs," she replied, leaning into his touch. "Bright but wary, expecting to be told he's not good enough." Isaac bent to press a kiss to the top of her head. "You have a gift for seeing the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." His voice lowered slightly. "You saw it in me when all I could see was vengeance." Delilah turned in her chair, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "And you saw me as worthy when my own community called me unholy." "The best partnership," he murmured, drawing her to her feet and into his arms, each helping the other see more clearly. As they stood together in the quiet of their simple home, Rebecca sleeping peacefully nearby, Delilah marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From the depths of loss and rejection, they had built something beautiful: a marriage, a family, a purpose that served others while healing themselves. "I have news," she said softly, looking up into the eyes of the man who had become her harbor in every storm. "Something I've suspected for a few weeks now." Understanding dawned in Isaac's expression, hope and wonder replacing curiosity. "Another child," Delilah nodded, her smile widening as his arms tightened around her. "If my calculations are correct, a spring baby." His response was to lift her gently, spinning her in a circle before setting her down with exaggerated care. "Are you happy about it?" he asked, searching her face. "With our travels, the uncertainty." "Completely happy," she assured him, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "Our children will have the richest education imaginable, not just from books, but from the world itself, from the people we meet, from watching their parents do work that matters." Isaac nodded, his expression softening as he placed a protective hand over her still flat abdomen. "Boy or girl, they'll have your heart and mind," he predicted. "And I'll teach them to shoot straight and ride well. And to judge people by their actions, not rumors," Delilah added, "to see beyond appearances to the truth beneath." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found in each other the courage to begin again, to build a life based not on society's expectations but on their own deepest values. Outside their window, the first star of evening appeared in the darkening sky, constant, unwavering, a beacon for travelers seeking home. Delilah thought of the accusation that had once driven her from everything familiar, unholy. How strange that word seemed now, how empty of meaning in the face of what they had created together. "They told me I was unholy," she whispered, echoing the words that had first drawn them together. Isaac's arms tightened around her, his reply the same promise he had made years before and kept every day since. "Then I'll be your prayer." And they were for each other, a living testament to the healing power of love freely given, of faith expressed through action rather than judgment, of two souls finding in each other the strength to become their best selves. Together they had transformed wounds into wisdom, rejection into purpose, and in doing so had discovered the most profound truth of all: that holiness resides not in rigid adherence to others' expectations, but in the courage to love authentically, to serve generously, and to build a life of meaning even when the path leads through wilderness.